Good morning. Good morning. Ooh, yeah, just like my classes. Fills my heart with great joy to introduce my old friend Andy Wood.
Young friend. Young friend.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
we've known each other a long time.
That's
okay.
that is correct.
We'll use that as old. Andy's been here in the Wilmington area for a very long time. He spent 12 years, I have to use my notes to make sure I get the right titles here, as education curator with the North Carolina Aquarium at Fort Fisher. And then he moved on to the National Audubon Society, where he was the state education director for North Carolina and did 11 years in that role. Currently, he is the executive director, is that the term we use?
That works.
Coastal Plain Conservation Group, and full disclosure, I'm also on his board. So, as you'll see from his talk, Andy is concerned about unrelenting, it says here, unfettered habitat loss and degradation from development activities in the region, and he's going to be talking about one aspect of that overall problem. So,
Thank you, Larry. Thank you very much. Wearing the mask at the beginning has hopefully served some function. Everybody be aware, we are still in a pandemic, and we are a living organism just as vulnerable to pandemics as a bat or any other living organism. So that said, thank you very much for coming out on this chilly day. I think the previous program was canceled because of a hurricane. Okay. So full circle, sort of. And actually, this is, I don't know how many of these I've done, but I used to kick off the first Saturdays each year when these started. So I feel right at home. Thanks. How long am I supposed to go?
45 to 60 minutes.
Okay, we'll try to keep it shorter. And so what we're going to be talking about, I will try to stay focused. Oh, wait a minute. Is this on, and can everybody hear me? Okay. I will try to stay focused. The only reason we have a PowerPoint is so that I will stay on point. Otherwise, there's no telling where we will go. I've been in the game of the environment quite literally all my life. I come from a long line of biologists. My father was a research manager with the American Cancer Society. So my guinea pigs, mice, and rats were the real deal. We had controls in one part of the basement and others that I wasn't allowed to play with in another part of the basement. This poster is from 1970. I was a teenage Naders Raider, and our role, quite literally, I'm a museum brat. I grew up in a nature center in Connecticut. And our role leading up to Earth Day, 1970, as kids, was to go out and put posters up all around various towns. And I kept one of those posters. This still hangs in my office. I've carried it all my life since 1970. And I've never shown it in a program, and I thought this morning, you know, I need to bring this out because what I'm hoping to do is instill a sense of, if not anger, among all of you, and I'm not trying to evoke anger, rebellion, some degree of rebellion, because, and my theme song driving in today was Burning Down the House by Talking Heads. We are burning down the house. We're watching it. I've been here, as Larry said, I've been here a while. I moved to Wilmington after a 10-year period in Texas at A&M, moved to Wilmington in 1985, and immediately knew I was in just an incredible place, just an outstanding ecological zone. Fly traps were interesting, but there's so much more to this place. And since 1985, I've watched this place plummet in ecological quality. And there are people that could be held to account most of them being our elected policymakers. Very quickly as additional background, since 1992, I've been keeping this animal in the upper right, upper left, from extinction. And actually my first probably 5 or 6 programs were just about this snail. I'm one of the few world's authorities on that animal, if not the world's authority. My mother wanted me to go into rhinoceros. I chose snails. So that is the magnificent ram's horn, and it is now extirpated, gone from the wild, but not extinct because Bill Adams, who retired from the Corps of Engineers, introduced this to me back in 1992, or he wanted to. So we spent summer of '92 exploring every pond we could legally get into from Brunswick to New Hanover County that was associated or is associated with the Cape Fear River, trying to find that snail. On one hot August day in summer '92, we found it in a pond in Brunswick County. Unfortunately, fall of '96, Hurricane Fran flooded that lake with salt water and wiped the snail out. It is salt intolerant. But luckily, I had brought it into captivity in '92 and was just keeping it in captivity sort of as an insurance policy. And lo and behold, that's where it remains today, along with its cousin. And you said there is a button that I can use as a pointer?
Mm-hmm. This one right here.
Thank you, the red one. That animal right there is called Greenfield ram's horn. And these are eggs of Magnifica right here hatching out. Actually, that's one of the first color photographs, that is the first color photograph, the first photograph of Magnifica hatchlings and Magnifica eggs. I've got lots of first photographs, first other things with that snail because it's a snail. That's its pond in Brunswick County. This is where it's relegated today, the Planorbella Conservatory. I'm glad to report that these tanks, which are some of them 30 years old and starting to get a little sketchy, the aquaculture tank manufacturer recently informed me that our new tanks will be available in February. So they've been ordered since September. Moving into the topic of today's program, I just wanted to give that background because we hear about fly traps, but there's so many other things in this area, far more rare than fly traps. The Greenfield ram's horn, which I didn't even touch on, it's also gone from the wild, but I have it in captivity. Fish and Wildlife doesn't want to list it as endangered for a very simple reason. If an animal gets listed as endangered, that triggers critical habitat status for wherever that animal is supposed to be. Who owns all the land where those animals are? Timber industries. Who would be jeopardized by another endangered species? Timber industries. So considerable lobbying has been done over the last 30 years, pushing back on my efforts to get the animal listed. I forgot the biggest news. In August, almost to the week of when we discovered Magnifica, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, after my third lawsuit, represented by the Center for Biological Diversity in California, the Fish and Wildlife Service finally said they will propose the snail for endangered species listing. That was completed in October. I have yet to hear anything from them. So they're still stalling. What we're going to be talking about today is another critical issue, and it is this big swath of green that you see right here. It is the Island Creek Basin ecosystem, which is otherwise just known as Island Creek Basin, but I'm calling it the ICBE, which is not an acronym, it's just an abbreviation. So here's the Northeast Cape Fear River. This is Island Creek that comes into, drains all of this land right here. That's the Island Creek Basin right there. Futch Creek right here. Hampstead is up here. This is the I-140 bypass. That's I-40 right there. This is Market Street going up to Hampstead. So Porter's Neck is in this area here. So that gives you an idea roughly of the area that we're talking about, which is broken up into little sub-basins, so to speak. Here's the main Island Creek. This tributary right here is called Unnamed Creek by Pender County. They refused to give it a name. And I'll get back to that in a moment. This is another tributary to Island Creek, which is flowing up to the northeast, which comes down to the Cape Fear, which goes out to the ocean. Sidbury Road, again, just giving you some reference and orientation. Basically, Pender County is here. This is New Hanover County. So we're talking about northeast New Hanover County and southeast Pender County. And in this ecoregion, this is actually Henderson's Creek, but some of the trees in there, this is a bald cypress. This is a day before winter solstice. And I just thought it was really cool because there's a hollow in the tree, and that's the sun behind it shining through this tree that I'm estimating is somewhere around 700 to 900 years old, roughly. It's a beautiful, beautiful bald cypress. Quite likely at one time in its life it had a ivory-billed woodpecker perched on it. Most likely Carolina parakeets were flitting around in it. They used to, those two birds, now extinct, used to inhabit these swamp forests. In fact, one of the last sightings of ivory-billed woodpecker was somewhere possibly in Island Creek. We don't know exactly, but reports are that the person who collected it was somewhere around Poplar Grove. So I'm thinking it was Island Creek. I'll try, I should start out with all due respect. The model of good governance. This is the model of good governance. After Hurricane Florence, Ogden was flooded. In the late 90s, operating under a permit issued through the State Museum of Natural Sciences, I went into this area before it was blown up. This was all Venus flytrap as ground cover. Purple pitcher plant, yellow pitcher plant, yellow butterwort, violet butterwort, grass pink orchids, plea, death camas. Well, that doesn't sound really great, but it's a beautiful flower. It's just every part of it is poisonous. This was all pond pine, pond cypress, savanna. Some of the last in New Hanover County, and it's all now gone. These soils are what we call hydric. They are wetland soils. They're muck, Merville muck, Leon fine loamy sand, Torhunta, Woodington, Stallings, a variety of soil types, all hydric, poorly draining, on a relatively flat topography. It floods. And everybody knew this floods, including the timber industries that owned it before it was developed. And that's evidenced by the fact that the timber companies ditched all of this land to drain it. This is Ogden, not Island Creek. But they ditched it and drained it to grow trees, which is permissible. But then after they were done growing trees, a developer moved in and said, well, this has been ditched and drained. The water table is now low, still hydric soils. There's still wetland plants out there, but the water table is low because it was ditched. The developer hired an environmental consultant who went out and did an analysis and said, yeah, water table is low, hydric plants, wetland plants, hydric soil, wetland soil, but low water table. We say this is no longer a wetland. And the Corps of Engineers agreed. Stamp, build out. That's what they got. After one storm event, this neighborhood is riddled with homes rotting on their foundations. Mold, mildew, rot. If you haven't noticed the vans that are driving through our area now that specialize in repairing cracked foundations, I remember that from Texas, because in Texas there's lots of montmorillonitic clay, shrink swell clay. Houses crack everywhere. They don't last 20 years in most wet environments. That's what we're seeing here. This is from B.W. Wells, one of a hero in North Carolina. This is specifically in reference to Island Creek and Burgaw Savannah and other areas right here in southeast North Carolina. So the poor soil drainage is due chiefly to three factors: flat topography, fine soil texture, and an underlaying layer of oftentimes clay. The water has nowhere to go. I'm going to blow through these slides. So in Sidbury, Savannah, which I interchange those names because the state Natural Heritage Program identified an area within Island Creek that they call Sidbury Road Significant Natural Heritage Area. They went in there and determined, oh my gosh, there are plants and animals here found nowhere else in the world, found nowhere else in southeastern North Carolina, but they are right here in Island Creek. This is a significant natural heritage area. And they've got this collection of natural communities that they have recognized in the area. Some of these communities are found nowhere else in the world. I'm not talking about vast areas of Utah. I'm talking about an area 14,000 acres in scope that is found nowhere else in the world, nowhere else in the universe, through which we are moving at about 500,000 miles an hour right now, as we spin at 1,000 miles an hour, as we orbit a big star that's orbiting, I digress. Here's an example of just how bizarre this habitat is. This is a longleaf pine right here, which typically grows in deep, sandy, well-drained soils, almost desert-like soils, high relic sand dunes going back 80,000 years. This ecosystem and all of them that you drive around in this area, they're generally 6,000 to 7,000 years old. That's about how old these ecosystems are, the ones that we see today. Growing right next to it is a pond cypress, which is usually found, as its name implies, in a pond. And yet they're growing 8 feet apart. That's how bizarre this ecosystem is. These are the soils that B.W. Wells was talking about, spotosols. You've got an organic layer. This is wiregrass, longleaf pine in the background, pond cypress, and pond pine not far away. So an organic layer at the very surface, an aluminum-rich surface soil layer, and then under that is this iron-laden clay. Water does not move through here. Not for days. After a half-inch rain, there's water standing here. In low places, as you'll see in other pictures, you end up with vegetation that looks like this, impenetrable. I wear Felcos on my belt because a machete won't go through this. It just bounces off whatever you hit, literally. So I use Felcos, little pruners, so that I can get through the greenbrier. For me to get to that tree right there from where I'm standing would take about 10 minutes, just clipping. And oftentimes I'm on hands and knees following trails that I tell myself are deer trails until I get up to a tree that's next to the trail and I see all these bite marks in it, and then I know, no, that's a bear trail. It's really kind of cool. Larry introduced me very nicely, and I appreciate that. I'm now self-employed, which means I'm unfiltered. I'm a conservation biologist, and my clients want me to be brutally honest with them, and their attorneys want me to be brutally honest with them. So I am. What's interesting, so I work in Island Creek, in parts of it on private lands. I manage about 2,500 acres of property in northeast New Hanover County for different land trusts and private entities. And so I'm intimately familiar. I can't tell you where I work because of NDAs, but the bears know me by smell. And 3 times now, I've retraced my steps and seen bear tracks on my footprints. And it's like, oh, are you guys following me? What's going on? So it's a magic place. That's what I'm trying to impart to you. This is an incredibly magic place. I was engaged back in '04 by a developer trying to blow up part of Island Creek, from which I resigned. When the developer finally made it evident that you're not listening to me. He wasn't listening to me. So here's, again, that spodic soil, that orange clay. This is Island Creek. And this was what I was finding in private property, admittedly. I did not sign a non-disclosure agreement with that developer, so I'm going to speak freely about that property. This was the ground cover. Venus flytrap, roundleaf sundew, another carnivorous plant. This is ground cover in an area that New Hanover County commissioners and Pender County commissioners now deem suitable only for community mixed-use development. That means everything from a gas station to apartments on this soil where these things dwell. This is a yellow butterwort. You've heard about Venus flytrap. In fact, if you've got a dictionary in the world, anywhere you are in the world, China, Afghanistan, doesn't matter. If you have a dictionary and you're a young child and you go to V, you'll find Venus flytrap. Venus flytrap is possibly the most recognized plant in the world. And the only place it occurs is within about 70, 80 miles of Wilmington. And ironically, it's gone from New Hanover County, save for a few patches in Island Creek. It's gone. I used to know 40 to 50 different populations in New Hanover County. They're all paved over now. So yellow butterwort is what the state natural heritage program found and said, oh, this qualifies as significant natural heritage area because it's not found anywhere else in New Hanover County anymore. That's yellow butterwort. This is the ground cover. Each one of those plants is a carnivorous plant. You would not want to be a tiny insect on the ground here. If you're a small ant or a thrip walking along and you step on one of those plants, that little black dot right there, these are covered with little black dots, digested insects that walked onto the pitcher plant, onto the butterwort. And you can see there's a little tiny insect right there and there and there. The leaf is covered with goblet cells that produce a little glue-like substance. And when a tiny insect walks on it, it gets mired in that glue. An electrical impulse stimulates the plant to produce more glue, and eventually the insect is just kind of gobbed up in jello and is screaming for help, somebody get me out of here, and it drowns in the glue. And then that glue also has various compounds in it that basically extract micronutrients out of the insect's body. We're all just sediment. We're all packets of nutrients moving around. So the spodosols that I've mentioned, this is where they occur. Right here, and a bunch of them in Florida. We have a lot of commonalities with Florida's ecosystem as well. So Southeast North Carolina is just an amazing spot. Here are the soil map for Island Creek. is what's so very telling, and it is what the Corps of Engineers and our elected policymakers are pretty much ignoring. When you look at all of those orange lines, they represent different soil types. But the important takeaway here, the highlighted area in this soil map is about 12,000 acres, 12,000 of them hydric, and 96 are not. These are the soils. Are they hydric? Yes. Oh, that one's not. And it's 8 acres. Yes, 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 yes. Oh, that one's not. And it's 78 acres. But the rest is hydric. Wet. Always will be wet. You can drain it, you can ditch it, but that does not make it non-jurisdictional wetland for development. After ditching and draining to grow trees, if you want to build that land, you have to first restore the hydrology. You have to fill the ditch. You have to return the water. Technically, you're not supposed to build for 5 years after timberland has been abandoned. We don't see that here. So, interestingly, this is the list of wetland plants that an environmental consultant, those are all the plants they have to look for. Out of hundreds of technically wetland obligate plants, they go by 26. That's it. And the Corps of Engineers buys off on this. So I don't get hired by developers because I look for Venus flytrap. Notice Venus flytrap is not in here. Butterwort is not in here. Pitcher plants are not in here. Well, they got cinnamon fern, but that's facultative. They got netted chain fern, that's obligate, but the difference being facultative plants can grow in wet or in semi-moist. Obligate are things like cattail. So they're going to look for a cattail. Yeah, we don't see any cattails here. Not wetland in the eyes of the consultant. And that's totally understandable. Their client is the developer. They're not going to tell the developer no. If they do, they'll never get hired again. I learned that lesson. This is slated to be community mixed use development. This is Island Creek. This, in fact, within about 1,000 feet of here is the Pleuris Municipal Wastewater Discharge Plant that they built. Pender and New Hanover County conspired with developers. Ooh, conspired, that's a harsh word. I'll say it again, conspired. They built a municipal wastewater treatment plant in the heart of Island Creek Basin ecosystem to discharge 250,000 gallons of so-called treated wastewater every day into your water, into your public trust water that Pender County calls Unnamed Creek, which right now is a trickle of water. We're in a sustained drought. We've been in a drought since about February. And all of Island Creek Basin right now is wet because we've received about 3 inches of rain in the last couple of weeks. But it's wet at the surface. The groundwater is still 19 inches, 14 to 19 inches below grade right now. That's the water table. But if we continue getting rain, that water table will be above grade. It will be sopping wet. You can't walk out there and not get wet throughout this area. Here is sand, and you can see that thick layer of organic matter on the surface of the sand. This is all relic sand dune. And this image is from 2006. Yellow pitcher plants, and there's purple pitchers mixed in there, some fly traps, butterwort, and not far from here is the Pleuris wastewater treatment plant that will be discharging the equivalent of 2,000 square foot homes of treated wastewater into your drinking water, because it's going not just into Unnamed Creek, which is basically just a trickle right now. They'll be contributing more water into Unnamed Creek than nature is contributing right now. And If that's not enough, they are set up and poised to inject through rapid infiltration that treated wastewater directly into the Castlehane aquifer. What vision, what foresight. Who needs that water? It's in the ground. Who needs that creek? It's just going to the Northeast Cape Fear River, which is going to the Cape Fear River, which is going out to the ocean. And what's it carrying anyway? It's treated wastewater. So what is it carrying anyway? It's carrying all of the chemotherapeutics that everybody consumes, all of the cleaners that we use. None of that stuff gets taken care of by a municipal wastewater treatment plant. So when we look at, with all due respect, I kind of like oysters, not as much as I used to, but we are what we eat. And when you do a thorough analysis of oysters in certain parts of our country, you find elevated levels of everything that we consume. A study done, I'm not sure if you were in on that one, Larry. You probably were. Years ago when I was at the aquarium, I played a very bit role in a fish study looking at fatty tissue and sunfish that were collected downstream from municipal wastewater treatment plants discharging into the Cape Fear River, of which there's about 16, from Greensboro to Wilmington. And what we found is elevated levels of Prozac and Viagra. Confused fish. So when we talk about treated wastewater, we are talking about water that has been treated to remove urine and feces, and that's it. None of the chemicals, not Gen X, which is flowing out of us as well. This is a pine woods tree frog. When you're walking through these habitats, you stumble on these guys with some frequency. It's a common tree frog. They hang out in knots in trees, or they'll just be perched on a tree. They're just the most charming frog you can imagine. This is Unnamed Creek, circa 2006. Six. So it was fairly wet. You can see there's water in here. That is what Unnamed Creek looks like. That's it. You can step over it in a step. This is what the Pleuris plant is going to be dumping 250,000 gallons of wastewater into every day. Every day. Here's another image of that property where the Pleuris plant, near where the Pleuris plant is located. This is a collection of water gum, Nyssa sylvatica, and pond cypress. That's water right here. Here's the ground that will soon have houses on it. Here is a test hole I dug with a set of post hole diggers, just random, out in soil. That is 14 inches from the ground surface right here. So when I squeezed the soil, I found, oh, there's clay in here. Water's not going to move through that. When the rain returns, that is coming up to here. But right now, the consultants are going out there rapidly, putting in test wells. Oh, look, the water is below 12 inches. This isn't a wetland. They're doing it right now because we're in a drought. Once the rains return, this whole system is going to look like that. This is what Island Creek looks like, the basin. That's what it looks like all the time, right now. If we go out there right now, just the 3 inches we've recently received, the ground is covered with water.
Are you saying that's just standing water?
That's just standing water.
It's not creaking, like it's not streaming?
It cannot percolate through the soil.
Thank you. Didn't want to interrupt you.
Nope. Chicken turtles, a state listed now special concern species, is out there. Probably one of the last populations in New Hanover County for sure. You can't maintain lumber production by building more lumber mills after you've cut down the forest. I paraphrase. So here is, again, the Ogden area. That's not a great picture. The point being, you can see this was green, not anymore. And this is all hydric soil. This is the ditch that was built, one of the ditches constructed in the Island Creek Basin to lower the water table. And this is a drought period, so you can see here's ground level. The water table is a solid almost 19 inches below grade. But once the rains return, this will be flooded, as evidenced by this plant right here, which is giant cane, our native bamboo. It's a wetland plant. These are all wetland plants. Regardless of what you do with the water table, the wetland plants will remain. They'll struggle, but they'll be there because when we do get a rain, the water doesn't percolate through the soil very quickly. So it stays saturated enough for the plants. How are we doing on time? Okay? Okay, all right. We have less than an hour to go. One of the rarest plants, it's not considered rare, but I can tell you I have only found this species of plant in one place in southeastern North Carolina, and it's Island Creek. Bottle gentian, it's gorgeous, gorgeous blue flower, and it was growing on the ditch bank. Here's what the habitat looks like. And many of you may live in a place that looked like that just a few years ago. And this is what we're talking about. It's not tropical rainforest with parrots flying around. This isn't everybody's passion, but when you come to know what's in here, it's just mystifying. It's just mystifying what lives in here. You're in that image right there, you're looking at about 7 species of trees and 12 different types of shrubs. And then an understory of mostly just moss because it's so dark. Including sphagnum moss, which is the precursor to peat moss that you buy at the hardware store. Again, this is the ground. This is what the ground looks like there. It's wet. And yet, we're able to get approval from the Corps of Engineers to build it out. And this is just to refresh ourselves at the thought that we get our water out of the ground, other than getting it out of the river. So here's the Castlehane Aquifer. We don't need that. Here's my real pet peeve. In 2006, leading up to the Unified Development Ordinance for Wilmington and New Hanover County, there was a group of about 14 or 17 people on the UDO committee. I and Tracy Scrable with Coastal Federation were the 2 environmental voices on that committee. The rest were developers, realtors, and lawyers for developers and realtors. Can you imagine how loud Tracy and my voices were? Whispers, whispers. We spent weeks talking about banners hanging over a sidewalk in downtown Wilmington. We spent less than one night talking about low impact development, which ironically I was fighting, because how is a bulldozer low impact? It's not. There is no such thing as low impact development. If you're developing something, that's high impact. The green building industry wants you to think, oh, it's green. Like sustainable development on a finite resource like planet Earth. How can you sustain development? It's like cookies in a jar. How many does the cookie jar hold? How many can you take out? Are you putting any back in? We're not making new land. And an inexorably expanding ocean is making sure we will not make new land. So what you're looking at here, this is Island Creek Basin. And in 2006, we were able to get through with the help of CAMA, conservation area designation, wetland resource protection area designation, aquifer resource protection. This bright green right here is all wetland resource protection area. Now come to 2016, one developer approached the New Hanover County Planning Board, who went to the New Hanover County Commissioners and said, let's redesignate all of this wetland protection nonsense to community mixed use development. And they did. The request from one developer. And boom, within weeks, we went from this designation to this designation. So my concern is they being our elected developer policymakers. I know that sounds harsh. My friends and colleagues wish I would quit saying it, but it's really hard to avoid the elephant in the room, or a gorilla, that happens to be the fact that every one of our county commissioners in New Hanover County is either a developer, a realtor, or a lawyer for a developer and realtor. All but 2 members of City Council are developers and realtors. All of the members of the planning board in the county are developers, realtors, and lawyers for developers and realtors. If your only tool is a hammer, you can finish this line. Everything looks like a nail. If your only tool is a bulldozer, everything looks like it needs to be paved. So that's where we are. They've changed the zoning. So what I am hoping we can do is come back to the commissioners, and it likely won't happen, especially if they see this, and request a rezoning back to this. Not for the sake of anybody in this room, maybe for you, but for the sake of you and our grandkids. This isn't in the interest of me protecting this area. I've had my fun time. We're taking away, we are robbing the legacy, the natural heritage that our grandkids should be able to enjoy. They're going to blow this up into structures that will have a life expectancy of about 20 to 30 years at best, and then they'll have to rebuild. The apartments that are being thrown up right now, and it's interesting that the commissioners say, we're trying to help the affordable housing, working class housing. The apartments they're throwing up are not affordable by the people who are building those apartments. Anyway, so you can see that this is just folly. That they admit it's a wetland, they did admit, it's the same leaders from 06 to 16. They knew in 06, this is all wetland. That's why we call it Wetland Resource Protection Area. But now they're calling it mixed use. So vibrant, prosperous, diverse, that sounds great. Professionalism, integrity, innovation, stewardship, accountability. Really? Really? We toss around the word resilience. In my mind, the term coastal resilience is a euphemism for stay put and drown. You can build bulkheads, living shorelines, all that stuff where the land and water meet, but we have to remember that's not going to stop an expanding ocean. We talk about the rising ocean. That's in increments of millimeters a year, more now. Oh, that's good news. So it's coming up a little more than just millimeters a year. But what we need to think about is not so much how high the ocean is rising, but the consequence of that rise, which is expansion. If I pour water on this flat table, and here in the coastal plain, part of the Atlantic coastal plain ecoregion, a biodiversity hotspot, if I pour water on this table, what's it going to do? It's going to spread out. And that's what the ocean is doing. It's spreading out. It's contaminating the Castlehane Aquifer. It's spreading out. Isn't it interesting that just recently it was announced New Hanover County, Brunswick, and Pender made $1 billion in sales of homes, $1 million and more in value was achieved in 2022. Many of those houses are in the most vulnerable locations imaginable. FEMA is going to have to buy out those properties at some point. I say FEMA, you and I. Those are going to get bought out one way or another, either by an insurance company or through a FEMA buyout. So when you hear about these billion-dollar sales, that's not all good news. So code of ethics, we don't need to worry about that. What I want to bring to attention, you can't make that out. 6.2% is what we get is contributed, or how to put this. So this is from New Hanover County. Employment by industry. Construction represents 6.2% for New Hanover County. Accommodations, 10%, 11%. Healthcare and social, 14%. Education, 9%. 8% for professional, scientific, technical services. Thank you, Larry. Retail, 13%. 6% for construction. We need to keep that in mind because the developer policymakers make a big deal about all the jobs that construction is creating. It pales in comparison to all of the other jobs. And these are fleeting jobs. There's talk now about an oncoming recession. We'll see just what happens here. Not going to worry about that or that because we're running out of time. But I do want to touch on this very quickly. 250,000, this is the Pleuris wastewater treatment plant. Again, more stuff. This is too much stuff. Because we're running out of time. Okay, we're back in Island Creek. Here's the Pleuris wastewater treatment plant. I identified this site for the developer that I was contracted with back in '06, and silly me, this is a high sand ridge right here. Longleaf pine, wiregrass. It's about 12 acres in a crescent shape. And I went to the developer and said, wow, you're not going to believe this place I just found. And was all excited about it, showed it to him, and he said, yeah, man, this is going to be the best place for us to build the biggest houses because it's high and dry. That didn't go through. The first developer in '06 stepped away from this project, sold it to somebody else. That developer has kind of stepped away now. Hired me though because he knew I knew the habitat from previous employment, but I had to resign from that one as well because he wouldn't listen to me. Now in this little crescent of sand is the Pleuris wastewater treatment plant that's going to be dumping 250,000 gallons of wastewater every day. And this is some of the stuff that they're going to be looking at. This is the draft NPDES permit that the state gave to Pleuris, saying, go ahead, this looks good to us. You're going to be dumping that into a creek that most of the year is dry, so the majority of water in that creek will be wastewater, so that's cool. But they're permitted for, or will be they are permitted for 250,000 gallons a day. MGD is million gallons per day, so 0.25. That's vision. And Larry, you were asking me about this the other day. So, trying not to get in the weeds here. Public supply groundwater use is 3.9 million gallons a day for Brunswick. Pender is in there somewhere, a lot. But for every 2 million gallons that Pender removes from the aquifer every day, Pleuris is going to be dumping 250,000 gallons of wastewater into that same aquifer every day. So we're pumping water out to drink while we pump sewage in to drink. Don't need that. Here's the typical scenario, a pretty woodland area, bulldoze it flat, put in a foundation, stick in a house, and put in irrigation in a wetland. Just to give you an idea of the biodiversity, or not so much biodiversity, but these are all of the plants, and that's us, people, that little orange right there. This is too complicated to go into right now. we're running out of time. Hurricane Florence, this is Ogden. Oop, red button. Ogden is right in this area here that received about 20 inches of rain. So yeah, it flooded. Here's Ogden flooded. This is 2 days or so after Florence. And the soils, Merville muck, Leon, Stallings, wetland. It's all wetland. So yeah, that's water. It's a bad picture, but that's water. This is water. That's water. That's all water. What a surprise. You've seen this. That's what we're doing to ourselves. But only by accepting and adopting a vision of a finite Earth can we save the human tribe from an increasingly desperate future. This was what Lindsey Grant was telling us in 1976. So, plundering of an ecoregion. This is why I was listening to Burning Down the House. This is Island Creek. That's Island Creek. This is Hampstead. Yesterday. No, day before yesterday. Yesterday. Yesterday afternoon. That's Island Creek. This is the vision that Pender and New Hanover County leaders have for an ecosystem found nowhere else in the world. If I sound put out, I am. So we're cooking the golden goose. Developers are scrambling the golden eggs. And what we need to do now, yikes, is, and as regards sedimentation. So here's all these problems. What can we do? What can all of us do? We can start making phone calls and sending emails and bitching as loudly as you want to the state primarily, but also to the county. So as regards sediment, when you see water that's chalky brown, looks like mocha coffee, it's not supposed to look like that ever in this area. Our water should always be clear. Every ditch, every stream, every pond should be clear. It can be dark, it can look like tea, it can look like clear black coffee, but it should not look like coffee with milk. If it does have that, Dan Sams, who already doesn't like me very much, would like to hear from you. Call him. There's his number. We need to report these things. Get put on record. I signed lots of, or I'm a signatory, as are Larry and others, signatories on various letters produced by other organizations that we send to Fish and Wildlife, EPA, and such. The beauty of doing that is your voice goes on record. If you send an email, if you send an email to Dan regarding water pollution, an email or a letter, it then becomes public trust property. And when I or somebody else issues a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request to Dan, asking for information about, has anybody complained about water pollution to you? Oh yeah, I've got this collection of 1,000 letters that have come in the last year. And what was your response? Oh, well, we were overstaffed. We couldn't send anybody out there to look at it. Oh, really? Interesting. And then we can go to court. But what we need right now is voices. We need voices. We need people to send an email complaining. Just say, or don't even complain. Just want you to know, FYI, this ditch, this pond, this creek looks like such and such. And just thought you should know. And if there's no response, then we have something to take to a judge and say, this is out of control. And it is out of control. So otherwise, just call the office. Patricia is a dear friend of mine. I so apologize to her for giving out this number, but we have to speak up. We're at that point. If we remain silent about this, Southeast North Carolina is toast. Scrambled eggs. That's all that it will be. So I get invited to everybody's parties. I'm available for birthdays and anniversaries. Yikes. Questions, complaints, criticisms? Actually, thank you. Thanks. Thank you. I'm going to close very, very quickly. So when we think about environmental matters, the question is, well, what has that got to do with us? How is this impacting us? So I want to do a very quick, do I have time for a very quick math exercise? I don't have this in the slideshow, I should. So imagine a food pyramid and put ourselves in that food pyramid. But for this exercise, at the bottom are plants. The food pyramid is surrounded by soil, air, and water, of course. So plants at the bottom, primary producers. Above the plants are eaters of plants. And in this example, we'll keep it aquatic. So it would be things like daphnia, copepods, amphipods, ostracods, little things, little tiny things with little tiny legs. Crustaceans related to shrimps and lobsters. Planktonic-like animals that are feeding on microalgae and other aquatic plants. In turn, they are eaten by fishes like little guppies called mosquito fish. The guppy is the South American counterpart to the North American mosquito fish. Each little guppy-like fish, the mosquito fish, each one weighs about 1 gram. In order to get to be 1 gram, they have to eat at least 10 times that amount. So in your food pyramid, this is an exercise in economics and ecology. So each time you climb a rung on the food pyramid, multiply the amount of energy required to take that step by 10. So you have lots of little tiainses feeding on plants that are eaten by those little fishes. 1 pound, I'm mixing weights here, 1 pound of mosquito fish will fill my cupped hands. 1 pound of mosquito fish have to eat at least 10 pounds of little crustacean-like animals. What eats the mosquito fish? A 1 pound sunfish. A 1 pound sunfish, this is a shell cracker, not my favorite fish because they get their name owing to the fact that they eat snails. So the shell cracker grows to be about 1 pound. In order to get to be 1 pound, it has to eat at least 10 pounds of other animals, including small fishes. What eats a sunfish? A largemouth bass. A 1 pound bass had to eat at least 10 pounds of sunfish equivalent. Remember, multiply by 10, magnitude. 1 pound bass, 10 pounds sunfish, 100 pounds mosquito fish, 1,000 pounds little tiainses. What about a 10 pound bass? A 10 pound largemouth bass had to eat at least 100 pounds of sunfish equivalent, which had to eat 1,000 pounds of mosquito fish equivalent, which had to eat 10,000 pounds, 5 tons, the equivalent of a school bus in little tiainses is required to produce 1 10-pound bass. That's neat numbers. Where's the relevance? In North Carolina, the pursuit, capture, and release, we don't eat bass, we throw them back. They're contaminated with methyl mercury, so we don't eat them. The pursuit and capture of that bass in North Carolina is worth about $150 million a year. That pales compared to Florida, where the pursuit, capture, and release of largemouth bass is worth over $1 billion a year. Oklahoma, oddly enough, $1 billion. California, not now because they're in a drought, but before their major drought, just 10 years ago, California was netting $2 billion a year. Just largemouth bass, not smallmouth, not trout, not flounder, just largemouth bass. It's worth lots of money, but I will argue it's not the bass that's worth that money. It's the little tiainses, the little micro, you can barely see them with the naked eye. They're the ones that feed this ecosystem. And how is it that all of that money is generated? When you see one of those pretty sparkly purple bass ranger boats, The hull of that boat, $40,000. The motor on the rear, if it's a 200 horsepower, multiply each horsepower by $100. It's $20,000 for the motor. $15,000 to $3,000 trailer hooked to a $60,000 Ford F-150. That rig is available for you to buy right now at Bass Pro Shop in Concord, North Carolina. Who should hire me as their spokesman? So for a clean $100,000, you can go bass fishing and throw the bass back, which means you have to go to a restaurant to get your dinner or go to a grocery store to buy makings for lunch. You've got a $100,000 rig in the parking lot. You're not sleeping on the ground, you're going to a hotel. So all of those things add up to form that economic engine driven, again, not by the bass, but by those little T-Eincies. I think that's it. I'm done. Thank you. Thanks very much. Yes?
Thank you. Any question about the 26 plants listed that you mentioned that the environmental consultants use to determine wetland? Who creates that list? What I'm getting
They
at
did.
is can we have a regulatory action to create some sort of legislation to expand that list, change that list? I mean, when was the last time it was updated? Is there any sort of room for growth?
A mechanism to expand it. If it is a thoroughly ethical environmental consultant, they will expand the list themselves. That's just the minimum. That's all they have to look for.
Who determines that list again?
Corps of Engineers and EPA. But the Corps of Engineers and EPA are family members. They're related to each other. They're separate entities, but they're both in the federal government. EPA loathes the idea of having to sue the Corps of Engineers for not upholding things like the Clean Water Act. They just don't want to get into that fight.
To that point, I do want to let everyone know, we will send the email addresses of his friends that he mentioned at EPA or at DEQ in our next email. If you're not on our list, please make sure you sign that piece of paper that went rolling around. We'll put those contacts from his presentation as well as the entire presentation linked to it in our next email. They come out every other Wednesday.
They're going to love me for that. Thank you. That'll be great. Yes?
If the Corps of Engineers ultimately the folks who make the decision about changing the status of these wetlands, why can't we petition them directly?
That's what we're doing. But we have to do it through EPA because the wetland rules are established by EPA, the Clean Water Act. This is what we're having to protect is the Clean Water Act. And EPA right now is pretty much asleep at the wheel, as is the State Department of Environmental Quality, with all due respect. They're overwhelmed. There are, I believe, 20 vacancies in the Wilmington Regional Office for environmental protection right now. 20 vacancies. So nobody's watching the hen house to speak of. They're way overwhelmed. They're all dedicated individuals, but they're overwhelmed. But it is EPA's jurisdiction to manage the Clean Water Act, but it is the Corps of Engineers that provides the regulatory authority for that protection. It's bizarre. So the Corps trusts the environmental consultants that they've come to know. So when the consultant comes to them and says, look, sand grains, it's not a wetland. And literally that's what they're doing. They're going to these areas where rain has washed the loam off of sand grains, and they'll put sand grains on their fingertip and say, look, sand, it's not a wetland. Ignore those pitcher plants and fly traps, and ignore the fact that it's Merville muck soil. There's sand grains. It's not a wetland. I know I sound cynical. That's how it's working right now. It's truly bizarre.
Well, if that's considering that situation, would it not have more impact if they literally saw photographs, that you could send photograph with your submission showing them what is, instead of...
That's what we're doing. But that's what the consultants are able to put in test wells adjacent to the ditch. The ditch creates a cone of dewatering for some distance away from the ditch. So they're doing creative soil analysis, and everybody knows that's what they're doing. Everybody knows it. So their wells are biased. It's not like random stratified transects where you use a computer to tell you where to put your test well. They're not doing that. They're going out and, that looks like a good spot. I think that'll work for my client. This is how it works.
Where that area in Island Creek that you showed being, clear cut and burned, how much of the area, like what is the square footage or whatever that is already destroyed?
Right now, underway, there's about 70, 80, roughly about 500 acres that are in process right now. But they just have been going gangbuster with a forest mulcher, Kershaw Hydroax, where they're just mulching areas.
They've cleared all of it to be developed? Like they've
No,
stamped?
not yet.
Oh,
We still have time.
okay.
We still have time, and it may require an injunction. I'm not opposed to trying to see what I can do with an injunction. Coastal Plain Conservation Group, of which Larry and I are affiliated, is the smallest nonprofit you've never heard of, because we're working with the most obscure species nobody's ever heard of. Snails? Really? Can't you pick something a little more iconic than a snail to, draw attention? No, snails are that important. Snails need to be the new iconic species. Without snails, our aquatic system would collapse. Snails are that important. You didn't see it on that screen, but snails, mollusks, are about, I think, the most common organism above a protist. Mollusks are hugely, snails and clams, wildly important to life on Earth, to all life on Earth. So forget rhinos. Well, no, don't forget rhinos. Yeah, it was about 4 billion, I think.
So we've done 50 years and another 4 billion. Not sustainable.
We're on a starship. And that's why I made mention of the fact we're skimming through the universe at 500,000 miles. Actually, the Milky Way is moving through the universe at 500,000 miles an hour, and we're in the Milky Way. We're a starship. We really are. And our life support system includes Island Creek. So when we think about life support systems here on Earth, the analogy would be the International Space Station, which is held together with nuts, bolts, and rivets. And I regard every species on the planet as a nut, bolt, or rivet. And on the space station, you can be assured they make sure that every nut, bolt, and rivet is in place. They don't want anything out of place. So it's their responsibility to make sure their life support system is intact. It's our responsibility for our own sake to make sure that our life support system is intact. And that means little nuts, bolts, and rivets, including snails.
Is there anybody at the Army Corps of Engineers locally that hears you and is somewhat aligned with your philosophy and scientific findings?
Absolutely.
But why can't they make a difference?
Because I'm not a billionaire from California.
You mean they're all bought out?
They're not bought out. The billionaires have environmental consultants that are able to skew the data.
But we have regulatory mandates, right? That they have to, obligate species have to be respected, right? I mean,
Yes, There's 3 criteria for wetland delineation: wetland plants, hydric soil, and groundwater within 12 inches of the soil surface during the growing season. The Corps does not go out and inspect all of these properties. So when you see a development go up, it's likely no regulatory agency has looked at that property. They've not set foot on it. They're accepting information from third-party consultants.
Is there no board, when I was in Massachusetts, there was a conservation commission filled with appointed volunteers, and we would go out to the sites and
We don't have
analyze
that.
them. No?
We don't
No
have
such
that
thing
here.
down here? No?
Nope.
Why
Well-
not?
Good question. Very good question. And it's because of politics.
I mean, in Massachusetts, the Conservation Commission can stop a project
Right. But,
in all of New England.
right,
I
but
mean,
we
it has huge power.
doesn't exist. And that's because our elected officials are developers and realtors now. That wasn't the case in the mid-'80s. In the mid-'80s, we had actual environmentalists on New Hanover County Commission, but not now.
So I just want to share, I took a wetlands certification class in 2012 in Raleigh. I didn't realize it was going to be packed with surveyors and developers. I was there really to learn about the wetland plants, and it was amazing how, this was like a 3.5-day class. You actually went out on site and they were showing you how to beat the system. I was horrified.
There was a workshop slated specifically for Island Creek to show developers how to game the system. One way they do it, and this is near and dear to Bob Parr's heart, all the burning of woody vegetation that you see going on right now, if you smell smoke, if you smell woody smoke, that's 1,000 times worse than cigarette smoke. It contains formaldehyde, polycyclic hydrocarbons, I mean all sorts of stuff you don't want to breathe, in addition to soot, which EPA is struggling to regulate. That burning oftentimes is being conducted under the guise of forestry. The developer gets a forestry permit to clear cut the land and a forestry permit to burn the wood. And then they announce to the newspaper, oh, there will be a controlled burn in this area for the next month. Well, that's under the guise of forestry. It's a violation of the Clean Air Act. All of this burning is a violation of the Clean Air Act, except forestry is exempt,
Right.
as is agriculture. Yikes. Okay, I'll stay here all day.
So when Orton Plantation does their controlled burn of the 10,000 acres that he has, or 7,600 acres, that's a violation of the Clean Air Act?
No, because that's all being done under forestry. That's forestry. It's managed by Tall Timbers, which is a forestry consulting company. So, and I do prescribed burns, but that's for forest conservation, to restore natural habitat.
So if you're clear cutting and you burn up the wood there, that's not really a controlled burn, but people are claiming those as controlled burns?
The developers are, yeah.
Wow.
But what is happening at Orton, for example, that's totally legitimate, because they're not going to develop that land. It's held in conservation. If it were not held in conservation, I'd have a concern. But it has an
Billionaire
easement.
behind the whole thing, though.
Sure. But at least it is
Yeah.
not going to be paved. We hope. Things change. Plans change. Conservation easements can be broken.
I'm gonna go ahead and
Yeah.
officially thank everybody for coming, and Andy's gonna be
Yikes.
hanging out a little longer, so if you do have extra questions for him, please do stick around and ask, but we're gonna respect everyone's time if
Yep.
you need to head out. If you have dirty dishes, there's space in that first room to put those dirty dishes on the counter. And I also wanted to remind some people. Oh, if you guys had mentioned to me that you needed to renew your membership or you wanted to become a member, you can come talk to me now too, and I can get you squared away with that. But thank you guys all again for coming.
Also, Chair,